Hey everybody, Sean from Media Assault here, and here we are at the last of the countdown to Star Trek Into Darkness film reviews, the marathon. Of course, the next one won't be part of the countdown, it will be actually the review of Star Trek Into Darkness, which is, of course, a sequel to 2009's Star Trek, which rebooted the entire series from scratch, wiping the slate clean and allowing a new generation of people to embrace the Star Trek universe through the original characters of Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Scott, Sulu, Uhura, so on and so forth. And there's an interesting plot development in this film, which I won't give away, because if you see this movie, it's kind of a joy to see this particular plot device used. But it allows older fans and fans of the older series to have something to hold on to. And it makes it so the first generation, the very first set of storylines isn't necessarily thrown out the window. And I won't say what it is. But that's kind of a nice thing to do for those fans and for fans of the series in general, which I don't think was necessary, but it's kind of a nice tip of the hat to the original series, the original inspiration for Star Trek in general. One thing I like about this film is that a familiarity with the original cast and the original series helps you embrace these characters, but you don't need that, as the performances by Chris Pine and Carl Urban and Zachary Quinto and Simon Pegg and so on and so forth, they're not really imitating the original actors. They're kind of doing their version of the characters, not so much they're not so much imitating them. They're just kind of channeling them a little bit through themselves, I guess. So they're reminiscent of the characters that we know and love, or at least that I know and love, but they're not coming across as a parody or intentionally humorous or going for laughs or anything. You're watching Kirk, and that's how Kirk would act. You're watching Spock, and that's how Spock would act. And it comes off as very natural and very, very, again, kind of a tribute, but again, these are the characters they're playing. So if you were to watch, say, a movie adaptation of Moby Dick, somebody would be playing Captain Ahab in relatively the same way that someone would play Captain Ahab in another adaptation of Moby Dick. So here we've got an adaptation, more or less, of the original Star Trek series for a new generation, and this is how these characters would act. At least that's how I look at it. The thing that I don't like about this movie is, well, it's not so much that I don't like it, it's just that the plot merely exists to get these characters together. This is an origin story, and like most origin stories, you know that these characters are going to get together. It's just the movie is necessary to get them together for those people who don't know how they got together, or if it is necessary to show how they got together. And as a result, the villain, as it were, in this particular movie, Captain or Commander or whatever, Nero, played by Eric Bana, he's not the most engaging villain. I would have to say that the villain in Star Trek Nemesis was a more interesting villain than Nero is, even though on paper the motivation for his character sounds fantastic, and this is going to make this guy super evil, and he's really got a motivation to be this really nasty guy. He really isn't, and he doesn't come across that way, and he's kind of milquetoast as a villain. I didn't really like him that much, and I didn't think he in and of himself was that good of a villain. I think some of the things that he did were interesting, and I think the idea is cool. I just don't think the execution was there. But primarily, this movie is about getting the original characters back together. Well, not back together, but together originally. It's kind of difficult when you're talking about characters that were together before, and now they're coming together again, but they never were together before. You know what I mean. These characters have to get together. The movie throws a couple of curveballs in so things don't fall into place exactly like you think they would, at least not at first. But I just think the the motivation and the reason that they're all back together, or not back together, I keep saying that, the reason that they all get together, the villain and the presence of that villain, just don't really do the film justice. They are cool, but it's not great. Let's put it that way. One thing that people had complained about this film when it first came out that I didn't notice for whatever reason, I don't know how I didn't notice this, but when I saw it in the theater when it first came out in 2009, a lot of people complained about the excessive lens flare or use of lens flare in this movie. And I didn't see it, and I didn't even think about it. And then this was the second time I sat down and watched it from beginning to end, and it was so obvious. I don't know how I didn't see it the first time I watched this film. It got really irritating and really annoying. And I understand some lens flare is, realistic, and you see it in real life, and blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, everything in this movie seems like it was polished for excessive lens flare, and it really, really did get annoying after a while. And it may have been because I was getting a slight headache while I was watching the movie, which wasn't caused by the movie, but it was just irritating that it seemed like somebody was shining a flashlight into the camera every 5 seconds. It was really, really annoying. I liked the movie a lot the first time that I saw it. I liked it a lot this time, but I didn't like it as much the second time. And I think the reason is after sitting through all of the other previous Star Trek films and kind of re-immersing myself in the Star Trek universe and knowing that, strategy and ethics and, plotting and doing the right thing for the right reasons is kind of the core of Star Trek. And the literal message in this film, which is actually delivered towards the end and somewhere in the middle, in kind of differing from different messengers, but the message is the same, is basically if it feels good, do it. Or, go with your gut type of thing. And I think that's sort of the anti-Star Trek, at least as I interpret it. So the movie is very Trek-like, and it's very Trek-light, not a reference to the lens flare, but it's not as cerebral as the original Treks were, and I'm really assuming on the part of the Next Generation Treks, because again, I never really watched that series, but I could tell from the 4 films that I did watch, they're even more cerebral than the original series, and that is not an element that's present here in large quantities. There's some of it, but not as much as there was in the original series, or I'm guessing as much as was in the Next Generation series. So this is Star Trek light, and it's very Star Trek-like because it is reminiscent of Trek at the surface level, but if you go a little bit deeper, it's not quite the Trek that I just sat through 10 films of. It's still a good movie. I still enjoyed it. It's still Star Trek. It's just more of a resemblance to Trek than being an actual hardcore Trek adventure with the exploration and the pondering and all that kind of stuff. The intelligentsia sitting behind the camera and writing the script. So I did like it. I think when I reviewed it originally, and I reviewed it on my website, a text review, I gave it 4.5 or 5 stars out of 5, 4.5 stars, something like that. My rating system here on the channels is a little bit different. So that would, translate into like an 8.5, 9, 10, somewhere up in that level. And I think I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. I liked it, I enjoyed it, but I didn't like it as much as I did the first time I saw it. It feels a little more removed from Trek now that I'm a little closer to Trek, rather than just feeding off memories of years gone by. I just finished watching 10 films of it. So I said before in my Nemesis review that I am a little leery of seeing Star Trek Into Darkness based on the trailers. I have heard from people who have seen Star Trek Into Darkness that it is really good. I spoke with a friend of mine who works for a theater chain, and they had a big meeting down in Nashville last week or 2 weeks ago, and they got to see 20 minutes of the film, and he assured me that it's very Trek-like, and he's a big Trek fan. So I'm going to take him at his word and put aside my doubts. I'm still going to go see it, but I will be leery. I can't help that. So we'll see what happens next week when I review Star Trek Into Darkness. But there you go. I got all caught up on time. Star Trek 2009, 7 out of 10. There's my review. As always, feel free to rate, comment, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. And thanks for watching. Take it easy.